Within the nucleus of every human cell is a spiral ladder of molecules containing coded chemical messages, blueprints for the development of that human being. The role of this deoxyribonucleic acid, otherwise known as DNA, and the genetic messages it contains only came to be understood by scientists during the second half of the 20th century. In 1953, an American, James Watson, and an English biologist, Francis Crick, discovered the structure of DNA, and in the 1970s, scientists unraveled the chemical connections between DNA sequences and genes. By the end of the 20th century, worldwide effort was being put into scrutinizing these genetic sequences. An international research body, the Human Genome Project, was set up with the aim of mapping the complete human genetic code. By 1997, 4,000 of the estimated 50 to 100,000 genes providing the blueprint for human development had been identified, and following rapid progress in the understanding of the genetic control of disease development, some of the most important inherited conditions had been identified, including several kinds of diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and Alzheimer's. At that time, researchers were discovering a new human gene almost weekly, and it was hoped that all would be known within a decade.
I used to be a scientist, a research scientist involved in immunology. Now, when people ask me about immunology, they usually think that's about immunizing people, but it's much more than that. And I used to be involved in doing research into the immune system, in transplantation, in how people get some kinds of cancers, and I use some of the techniques of molecular biology, genetic engineering. As a Christian, I've always understood that science is a gift to humanity to be explored and to be utilized. Christians often talk about having stewardship of God's creation. In other words, being responsible and having a privilege and a role within it. And I see science, if you like, as a handmaiden of that. It's a way of developing the world and understanding and using resources. Of course, we must have limits to anything that's done. Some Christians would say we shouldn't touch genetics with a barge pole because we're meddling with nature and what God intended. I don't believe that is the line we should draw, because we'd never do anything as scientists. I think we have a responsibility to use knowledge for the development of God's world and the improvement of it. But there are going to be limits as to where we should stop. When we try and help somebody who has a genetic disease, there are two approaches we could use. We could either try and interfere or change the genetic material in that individual, say a little girl who has a particular disease which we know is caused by a gene. We could attempt to treat her by modifying her DNA, and that would only affect her. Now, there is another way of modifying the DNA, and when we talk about modifying the DNA of just the little girl, we call it somatic modification. Soma means body. The other way is to actually try and get at the genes which are being passed on that might have caused her disease. So we talk about the germline, in other words, the genes that have been passed down through the mother and the father to other generations. Now, at the moment, scientists of different religious persuasions, and certainly Christian ones, would feel that we must not start to interfere with the germline DNA, because once we get into that, we're actually affecting future generations. We don't know how many generations. Once we do something there, it can be passed on and have untold effects in the future, which we have no idea what they might be. And I think the other aspect I'd like to suggest limitations to, and I think is something that is of common concern, again, not just to Christian people, is where genetic modifications become literally engineering of people. I think a lot of people were very frightened when they heard about the production of Dolly the sheep. Now, this whole idea of treating people as commodities and interfering with their DNA from outside, I think, is going down an avenue which Christians would feel profoundly uncomfortable about.
I think many people would say there used to be something called eugenics and it was bad. It happened in Nazi Germany, it happened in the United States where people were compulsorily sterilized. We've got beyond that. But eugenics in the broadest sense is using genetic knowledge to make choices about future lives. And that's already here with us. Resisting the kinds of things that went on in the eugenics of the 1920s and 1930s, genetic technicians, counselors, doctors, scientists have come together on a consensus that what's really important is to give people choices. That's what distinguishes genetic counseling from eugenics. But really, I think it's a different form of eugenics. It's a different way of using genetic knowledge to shape the future. And we have to decide both individually and collectively what we want to know and how we want to use that knowledge.
I think in every generation there will be a Hitler, and we can't control for that. But all the scientists whom I know are responsible, very serious people and wish to pursue their science for the benefit of humankind. And it is for this reason that I'm optimistic for the future.
Sometimes we know less about the technology than we think we know. I think the Christian perspective would say, you may have knowledge, but do you have wisdom? In other words, we may know what we can do, but do we know how we should use it or not use it? Christians are concerned, as many other faiths are concerned, to protect the weak. And the generations that are as yet unborn represent part of the weak and the voiceless.
Using in vitro fertilization techniques, doctors can identify an egg with a particular genetic defect and ensure that only a healthy one is implanted. The first baby from an egg selected in this way has already been born in Britain, free of a hereditary fatal lung disease. The question is, where should screening out genetic imperfection stop? For a Bedfordshire family, genetic selection of the embryo could prevent another tragedy. The father of Steve and Darren Cummings and all their aunts and uncles died young from heart failure. All their lives they feared they too had inherited what's known as sudden death syndrome. Now a new genetic test has confirmed they have the gene.
I can never understand why I couldn't run as far as anybody else, because as far as I was concerned, I thought I was quite fit. I also went boxing and got as far as to go for my medical to start fighting, and actually failed my medical with the doctor, and that's when I actually realised why. And my mum told me and my dad told me what was the matter really. We can't really go too far with sporting events because it's dangerous.
Now Steve's baby daughter sleeps with a monitor in her cot, tracking her heartbeat. They don't yet know if she's inherited the gene, but her mother knows that if she has another child, there's a 50-50 chance it will inherit its father's heart condition. They'd like another baby. Now they've been offered the chance to have an egg selected, free of this lethal disease.
We would have the gene test done because it's done at such an early stage. And just with the egg, they can check from the egg, from taking the egg from the female, and if that gene's there, then you know, then I think that's a good thing.
It could guarantee the implantation of a normal embryo, a normal pregnancy, and a child who was not affected. And in that, so again, very limited circumstance, I think you can make the argument that in vitro fertilization and, if you will, genetic manipulation is warranted or is perhaps appropriate.
Critics would say that it's the thin end of the wedge, and eugenics is the logical conclusion of that argument, choosing the fittest.
That is true. The other side of the coin is that, do you choose to bring a child into the world who has probably an 80% chance of being dead before the age of 25?
Colin Wiggins has brittle bone disease. His body lacks the protein collagen that makes bones strong, so he breaks bones just turning over in bed. He's had over 200 fractures in 40 years, each as painful for him as a fracture is for anyone. He's recently had 2 broken limbs and 2 crushed vertebrae. Colin and his wife Zoe have both been married before. She already had 2 children, and Colin had an able-bodied son. Encouraged by that fact, Colin and Zoe decided to have a child of their own. They did so knowing there was a 50% risk of passing on the disease. And indeed, their daughter Laura was born with brittle bones. She now needs her own nurse, and the family has its own specially adapted ambulance.
When we had Laura, we made a conscious decision to have a child, irrespective of the chances. We took the chance. I very much wanted to have children with Zoe because I think marriages are very sort of selfish and insular if children aren't there. I mean, I think a family's a family once you've had children. When we found out Laura was brittle, I felt like a real heel. I felt, here you are, you've inflicted this upon another human being. When it really hit home to me was when she first started breaking. And the screams of when she fell down on... She just sat down on a nappy. Our babies do fall on their bottom, and broke her leg and her pelvis in one go. And she screamed, and we rushed her to hospital, didn't we? And that's when it really hit home to me.
9, 8, 9. 9. So we want the word for 9. Where's the word for 9?
How many cases are there?
There was another consideration in their deciding to have Laura. Brittle bones is not in Colin's family. He's the first to have it. In passing it on to Laura, he was starting up a new strain of the disease.
I had sort of awful moral sort of dilemmas going around in my brain that shouldn't I have stopped this deformity? Should I have not allowed this to continue? Because being the sort of start of a new strain of brittle bones, I should have had the strength of mind or morality, I suppose, to not having any children. But now, on reflection, I would do it all the same again. Laura has many breaks. She has a lot of suffering, which I wouldn't wish on her, obviously, but she has something about her, and many of the brittle children do. They have a spark about them. I mean, she's a happy little girl, and happy means waking up and being glad to be alive, and she is.
Etty Weinbaum and Avremel Brickman were brought together by genetics, with a little help from Etty's mother, Sandy Weinbaum.
I have, I think it's considered a large family. I have 14 children. My second child, who is a daughter, is getting married now. The rest are growing up and getting ready to get married. We don't encourage dating. So the girls are brought up in a pretty much girls-only environment, and the boys are brought up in a pretty much boys-only environment. So when they feel that they're ready to settle down, then it's up to us to start to make inquiries to find a match for a child.
Parents usually begin with a matchmaker. That's an ancient custom, but Rabbi Lew brings it right up to date.
The matchmaker, or the shadchan as we call it, is somebody who is approached by the parents of the boy or the girl and facilitates an introduction where they meet. The backgrounds have been checked for compatibility, that there is nothing untoward that one wants to eliminate.
So what kinds of qualities are families looking for?
Every person would want certain qualities according to the priorities of the family and according to the needs of the individual child.
Yeah.
But God-fearing, good character, and good health would be important.
And how important is good health for most families?
For most families, it's very important. Obviously, for different people, it might be, if you want to quantify it, it might be 60%, it might be 80%, you know, something which they will not compromise on at all. One does know of families where there is some sort of genetic illness or the fear that there might be a genetic illness, and they might have to compromise in the partner or in the person they're going to meet.
It's a compromise many are willing to make when facing a fatal genetic illness, Tay-Sachs disease.
This card is your white card. Look after this very carefully because...
At this school in North London, they're testing teenagers to see who carries the Tay-Sachs gene. Someone who has one copy of the gene is perfectly healthy. Only if their marriage partner is also a carrier is there a danger that a child will be born with the disease. Rabbi Eckstein came up with an extraordinary scheme. Nobody's told if they test positive or negative. Their result is kept secret.
We don't want your name on this. No names appear on this at any stage. We ask you to sign it using your assigned number, the number on the white card.
When a match is suggested, the numbers of the two young people are compared. The parents are simply told a match is compatible or incompatible.
When the particular young man that Etty's getting married to was suggested, it was done through a shadchan, an intermediary, and we gave Etty's number and Avrammel's parents gave his number, and the inquiries were made originally then, before they even went out the first time. So they knew that from at least that point of view they were compatible.
Beautiful. Okay, one like this. It's very, very good.
It's taken for granted that part of getting married is a natural progression to starting a family. So therefore, genetic screening later on would create numerous problems because abortion is not really an acceptable option in most cases. So it was a very big relief. When I got the compatible result, I was very happy. Etty was even happier.